Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. I'm Captain Xavier, and I'm finally going to start covering some of the tools and techniques that I use for integrations. And these will not be comprehensive videos by any means. There are lots of tools and techniques that I don't know because I simply haven't needed them or I've never actually gotten around to learning them, which is one of the things I love about this series is because people constantly comment things that I didn't know about. But these are the tools and techniques that I have acquired over my Nerf modding career thus far. And we're going to start with shell cutting, or cutting tools in general. If you need to cut just about anything, something here will suffice. We're also going to look at power tools and possibly one device that you're much less likely to use, but that I have used in Nerf modding occasionally in the past. We're going to start at the very low-tech end of it and work our way up to the high-tech end of it. We're going to be starting with just blades. So I have both the extendable, adjustable, lockable X-Acto knives, and these are occasionally useful for making very small cuts. If you're just trying to trim a little bit off of something, or if you're trying to get into somewhere that's very narrow and there isn't enough room to get a power tool in there, you can sometimes get a blade in there if you just need to widen something a bit or shave off just a little bit. It also can be used if you want to make a cut that doesn't remove material. So if you're trying to make a slice in the shell, but you don't want there to be a slot where a saw blade removed material, you can use an X-Acto knife and just go over that same area over and over and over and over, cutting a little bit deeper each time, and you can eventually make it all the way through a shell. There have been a couple of times where I've done this, often to cut the ring around a barrel, like on the Rebel electronic blaster. The barrel was glued on, and a lot of Busby blasters, the barrel cap is glued on, and you can slice through it using an X-Acto knife, and it will make a fairly clean cut. I also have, an actual X-Acto knife with a very sharp blade. This I generally use for stencils. I don't really use this much for shell work, but it would work just as well. These you need to be very, very careful with. Always cut away from yourself and don't push harder than truly necessary, because if it slips, make sure you know where the blade will go if it slips. I've cut myself a number of times and had to super glue myself back together as a result of not following that particular piece of advice. Gloves are also always a very good idea. Next, we have cutters. Side cutters and edge cutters, and these were not something that I had ever thought to use. But then I watched a couple of videos by, I think Mr. Nathan uses this technique a lot. I'll just grab a bit of random shell for now. But this allows you to make very small cuts and very precise cuts, because you can tell exactly where the blade, or the two blades are lined up, and so you remove exactly what you want to remove and nothing more. You can take very small cuts. You can take longer, straighter cuts. You can also use the straight edge ones in a similar manner, but the end cutters I find to be a little bit better. But just nibbling away. And it will work fairly well to take just a little bit off, not too much, and you're much less likely to take way too much or cut in an angle you weren't expecting, because you can see exactly where those cutters are. So those are very, very nice. Next thing that I highly recommend is a good set of files. And these ones, I think I got at Ace Hardware, are diamond edged, so it doesn't matter which direction you file in, they file equally well. I've got one that's a crescent, it's round on one side, flat on the other, tapers, which is good for a lot of strange ones. I've got another one that's flat and squared, which is good for making slots and grooves and things like that. I've got one that's entirely round if you need to do, curved areas that you need to file into. And then I have one that is entirely square and tapered, which also has different properties than the one that isn't. So those are very, very useful. It does take a long time. It's something that requires a little bit of patience, but it is another area where you're very unlikely to take off more material than you want. because it goes slow enough. You just file a little bit, check it, check your measurements, check the fit, file a little bit more, check the measurement, check the fit, and you don't have to worry about taking off too much. But you can make squared, you can make round. I also have one that is actually triangular, so I can actually make sharper, a more acute angle than 90 degrees, which is good sometimes for filing trigger catches, because you can actually make it angled back, and so it catches things much better. So a triangular one is one I highly recommend. I also have some larger, coarser, round ones, and these are actually true toothed files, I guess you would call them. And these are the ones I use for boring out barrels to put brass in. And these take off a lot more material with each stroke, but they only take off material in one direction, which is forward. It doesn't actually do anything when you pull back, or it does very, very little because the teeth are pointed in the opposite direction. So it's a forward motion, not a sawing motion, just forward. And that will give you, again, more control when you just push forward and then pull back and then push forward. And you can get an idea of exactly how far you go with each stroke. And that one you can actually start cutting fairly deeply with fairly quickly because it is sharp. These ones will work on hardwood, they'll work on metal, they'll work on all sorts of materials, but they work very well on plastic. And then I also have a flat one that's also curved on the other side, and this is, again, good for either long, flat surfaces, and again, it only does anything when you push forward, it does nothing when you pull back, and it's just a matter of push forward, and it will remove the material that you want. You can, depending on your file, some will actually be sharp along the edges. This one isn't, so you can't actually, or it is a little, but it's not very sharp, which means you can go right up against an area that you don't want to cut, and it won't dig into the side as much as just dig straight down, which is good if you're trying to lower the depth of an area. So, files, learn to use them, get a good set, definitely important. Next, we're going to look at hand saws. And I've got two varieties here. I've got a big, heavy hacksaw, generally used for cutting pipe or PVC or metal, stuff like that. But it will work on plastic very, very well. And again, this one is also only toothed in one direction, which is forward. So on the forward stroke, it'll actually cut. On the back stroke, it doesn't, or at least not nearly as much. And so be aware of that when you're trying to cut. It allows you a little bit more precision when you know that it's only on the forward stroke. And you can be careful not to go too deep. And that is the big risk, is go slow when you're cutting, because if you cut too much, you can't do anything about that. At least it's much more difficult to put material back, whereas if you haven't cut enough, you can always cut a little bit more. So go very slow, make sure you don't go too far. We then have a much smaller hand one, which has a little bit more versatility, a little bit more maneuverability, because the blade is exposed at the end, so you can get into smaller areas. And currently I've got this one in here so that it cuts on the draw rather than the push, because this doesn't have the whole handle, and so it's a little bit easier to do a draw cut. Though you could push it the other way if you preferred the other way. It will cut in both directions, but it just doesn't cut nearly as well against the tooth. And the blade should indicate which way is the cutting direction. So, but you could easily flip it over and go the other way if you wanted to push rather than pull. Up to you. Now, if you're wanting to make really straight cuts, I recommend one of these gizmos. It's a miter box. You put whatever you're cutting inside the box. It's designed to hook onto the edge of a table, so when you push with your saw blade, it catches the edge of the table and doesn't wander. But you can use it with a hacksaw, you can use it with a wood saw, you can use it with whatever saw you want. It's generally designed to go with a wood saw because they have, no handle on the end. Though on the wide area, you can still get a fairly good stroke back and forth. Good for cutting pipe, good for cutting foam. Some shells, if you can actually fit them in there and you want a really straight cut, that will work. So keep that in mind. Also good if you're cutting wood or plastic, other things. Alright, that covers all of the manual tools. Sandpaper, actually, the last one I'm going to cover is sandpaper. Sandpaper is, I would still argue, used for altering the shape of a shell, so it is kind of a cutting device, so it's, more of an abrasive. But there are places where you will use sandpaper to carve things out, shave things out, clean up your cuts afterwards. Some of these devices will leave burrs on the plastic, and you'll go over it with either your files or with sandpaper to smooth it out. So lots and lots of different grits. Generally for early plastic work, I will use something around 250 to 400. Grit will give you a fairly smooth edge. If you want it to be as smooth as the plastic originally was, you're going to be getting into 600, 700, 1000 grit. If you want it absolutely polished, 1500 grit. All of that can be gotten at just about any hardware store, and sandpaper's fairly cheap. It generally won't last very long because the plastic will gum up the sandpaper. I have used the flexible sandpaper, the rubbery back stuff, and that stuff lasts a lot longer and is really, really nice. So I recommend those as well. Now, let's get into power tools, because they are more fun. This is where things start getting more expensive. The value of having the right tools really cannot be underestimated, but the cost of acquiring them can certainly get expensive. So, the first one I'm going to look at is a jigsaw, or rather, jigsaw, variable speed jigsaw, and it is basically all of your saws put into one, the different kinds of saw blades that you might want, and then motorized. So you can get yourself a variety pack of blades, which have ones for wood, for plastic, ones that are specifically designed for metal. They have narrower blades, which allow you to make a sharper turn, a sharper corner, if you're trying to do, round, really tight corners. A narrower, or a blade that's not as wide will allow for that. Yeah. Again, this one's variable speed. I recommend getting a variable speed one if you can, because you don't want to go too fast, because if you go really, really fast with your saw blade, the plastic will melt, and it will actually seal itself closed as you go, which doesn't do you any good. So again, nice, slow, in order to make your cuts, and it works very, very well. Like I said, narrower blades allow for sharper corners, and these ones are good if you're not trying to do a really straight line. This is not a tool for straight line cuts. This is more for curved cuts, jigsaw type cuts, thus, jigsaw. So, highly recommend one of those, as well as a pack of various blades. Another very common tool that you're going to want in Nerf, and I'm putting this again down under the shell cutting because you use it to alter the shells, is a good drill. Cordless, corded, whichever you prefer. Variable speed, again, is best, as well as variable torque. Having a clutch on there is good if you're actually going to be using it for taking screws out, but for what we're wanting, you can just use the drill bit end. And, of course, a good drill bit set. So, all the different sizes that you're going to need generally will fit into a drill. I do have some that really will only fit on my drill press, because they don't have the narrowed head on them, or the narrowed stock, and so be aware of that. But you can use the drill to not only just obviously make holes, but you can also use it to make slots and grooves if you're going to have something that slides back and forth. A drill can sometimes allow for that. You can also use the drill to drill a couple of holes that you can then get your saw blade into if you're cutting out of the middle of something. So if you're trying to cut a hole in the middle, generally what you'll do is you'll drill a large hole that's large enough for the drill bit to go into, and then you can get your drill bit in and start cutting your the actual hole out, and then you can use files to clean it up. So if you're doing something like cutting a hole for a voltmeter or something into the shell, or an ammo counter or something, using the drill to create the initial holes and then cutting it with either the saws or Dremels or whatever else is a very useful technique. Obviously, one of the most powerful tools you're ever going to have in just about anything, and especially in Nerf, is a good multi-speed Dremel. I have two different ones, and I'm looking to get a cordless one. Both of mine are currently corded. This one has adjustable speed that you set, and it spins. Always use eye protection, of course. And generally you don't want to use gloves with any kind of a rotary tool, because if it catches, it'll twist and bad things can happen. But do be careful, again, cutting away from yourself. I've cut myself a couple of times with a Dremel and done some unpleasant things because I wasn't paying attention. What I have on here is, again, another cutting disc. It's a metal cut-off blade. Works very, very well on plastic. And once again, you're going to want to use a fairly low speed, because otherwise the plastic will melt. It also does cut a fair amount of material out of it, so take that into account when you're making your measurements, that, you know, there is going to be material lost to the cutting. There are, of course, also a huge variety of cutting implements and grinding implements and all sorts of other tools that you can get, all the different heads that you can get for these. Carving bits and sanding bits and just about anything else that you know, all of these other tools give you manually, you can probably get to have a Dremel do automated. I then have a second Dremel that goes to a foot pedal that's a much higher torque Dremel, and also variable speed that I keep a grinding bit on, which is fantastic when you're trying to cut things out of the inside of the shell, like screw posts and supports and all that sort of thing. It is hitting the cord that my phone is plugged into, so that's why it's shaking. But very, very functional for cutting. The downside to this is it's kind of easy to cut more material than you were expecting to. So be sure that you know exactly where you want to stop cutting and mark it very, very clearly. Another thing that you can actually do with this particular head is you can actually use it to drill holes. So if you're doing the thing where you're cutting out, you know, a hole for an ammo counter or a voltmeter, you can do that with a Dremel cut in, and then cut as much of your shape out as you want, and then use files to square it all off. The right angle file or the triangular file work very nicely for that. That's what we have for smaller tools. We're now going to take a look at the big ones. And this is where things really start getting expensive, but where things really start getting easier if you have these tools. Alright, this is a bandsaw, and it is the tool that probably gets the most use as far as cutting in my shop, and one of the tools that people specifically come to my shop to be able to use, because it can do things that other tools can't do, and it could definitely do them a lot faster. It is single directional. Once again, you can tell which way the teeth are shaped, and the blade only goes in that direction. So it is a constant sawing, unlike the scroll saw, which goes up and down and reciprocates. This one is single direction, so you have a single smooth cut. And this is one that if you ever watched somebody cut on a bandsaw, they've almost guarantee that they have sped up the footage. Because in order to get an accurate cut on a bandsaw, you actually need to go very slowly if you're cutting anything more than a really short piece of material. Because the blade will tend to try to want to wander a little bit if you go too quickly. If you put too much force on the blade will then warp slightly. So you have to go slowly enough that it's cutting without having the blade warped in any way. So a lot of the footage that you will see, even though it doesn't look like it's been sped up, it probably has, because they were probably going painfully slow in normal time. And so they speed it up to what looks like just, what would look like a normal speed, but it's actually slowed down. This is another one you want to be very, very careful with. Gloves are something you're going to want to consider. If you slip, this will take off a finger before you even know you've started to get hurt. So be very careful when you're using any kind of a serious power tool. Up next we have what is called a scroll saw. And this one has an incredibly, incredibly narrow blade so that you can make extremely sharp turns. This one's more jigsaw-y than the jigsaw. And this one is a great one if you're trying to do sharp corners or, weird shapes or things like that. It is a reciprocating blade, so you do have to be careful of that. Unlike the bandsaw, which is always pulling your material down towards the base, this one is going to have it popping back up. So you need to hold the piece down onto the base firmly when you're going to cut. The downside of the scroll saw is it doesn't have a variable speed, and it is going fast enough to melt the plastic back to itself. So you may end up having to make the cut more than once in order to actually get all the way through, which is a bit of a bummer, but it is still a very useful tool for a lot of things. The other advantage that it has over the bandsaw is that there's nothing on either side of the blade, so you can cut something that's very, very long as it's not too tall, whereas the bandsaw can cut things that are a little bit taller, but the far edge of it gets in the way of any really long materials. So, depends on what you're, planning to do with it. Alright, what's next? I mentioned sandpaper as a shell-changing shape device. This is the motorized version of that. This is a belt sander, and it allows you to smooth things out. So if you've made a cut, like the one here, and it's not... Focus. If you've made a cut like the one you've got here, and it's not quite flat because you were using a handsaw or, something, this will allow you to flatten that out. And now you have an actual flat edge. This is another one you're going to want to be really careful with because it will take off way more material than you're expecting, way faster than you're expecting. It also only has the one speed, and if you push too hard, it will in fact melt the plastic, and then you'll end up with gobs of melted plastic that you then have to clean off, but that's not too difficult. Lovely. Next. Here's one you're not likely to actually use too much in your shell cutting, but I think it's still worth mentioning. This is a bench grinder, and generally these things are used for grinding metal. There's not a whole lot of applications you would need this for that couldn't be done better with a different tool. But it is still a tool that you will use to shape materials, especially if you start using metal, like I like using a lot. You're going to need one of these if you want to clean up the edges and all that sort of thing. But you can, in fact, use it to shape plastic. It also only has the one speed and will very definitely melt the plastic, and you will need to clean it up. But you can often do that while it's slowing down. The other side, I have a wire wheel, which is good for cleaning metal and taking off paint and stuff, though it'll take up a lot of plastic, so you're going to want to be careful about that. But another very, very useful tool. Up next, we have another lovely tool. This is the bench-mounted equivalent of a drill. This is a drill press. And it has the advantage of being very, very precise. It drills directly straight down, so you don't have to worry about being off at an angle when you drill. You can also, on this side, on most models of one kind or another, there will be a way to set the depth. So you can only drill exactly as deep as you want to, which is very, very useful if you need to not drill all the way through the material. You just want to make a dent in it or some kind, or a hole that doesn't go all the way through. Using the depth adjuster will allow you to do that. This is also what I use when I want to bore out barrels. And I generally won't actually turn the drill on. I will just use it to hold the drill bit, and then I will manually rotate it to bore out the barrel until I've got it actually bored out, and then I will use this to ream it and clean it once it's done, because it's moving too fast, and if it catches the plastic, it'll spin. This is a device you definitely don't want to wear a glove with, because if it catches the glove, it's going to shatter most of the bones in your hand before you have time to scream. So, there you have it. All of these power tools you definitely want to be very careful with, and if you are a small child, do so. Use it only with adult supervision. If you're adult, pay attention. These things are dangerous. They have a lot of power in them. These next ones are not ones you're likely to use very often in Nerf, but they do have some unique capabilities that make them useful, and if you have them, it's another tool that you can use. The first is a table saw. Now, table saws are generally used for cutting wood, but with the right blade and under the right circumstances, they can be useful for Nerf because they cut a very, very straight line. Whereas most of the tools that we've looked at so far have the ability to do a lot more wobbling as you're trying to cut. It's very hard to cut a perfectly straight line unless you're very, very careful. And even then, because the width of the blade is such that it can get wobbly, you run into that problem. Where with a table saw, because the blade is designed the way it is, and it's a very, very large blade and has a very large cutting area, it tends to make for a much straighter cut. You also then have the guide that you can use to make sure that your cut is perfectly straight. Another tool that you need to be very, very careful with because they are extremely dangerous. I also use them for doing a lot of the woodwork that I use, of course. It is the most common thing I use it for, is for cutting wood. And we do use some wood in Nerf here and there if you're making custom stocks or whatnot. So, useful tool. If you happen to have access to one, be aware that it can be handy. This last item is definitely something most of you are not going to have and are probably never going to need and are probably not even aware of the existence of. This is what is known as Beverly shears, or bench shears. And they are shears that are mounted, again, to a bench. I generally mount it on the edge here and then use a vice grip or vice clamp to clamp it into place because I don't use it very often, and so I only take it out and mount it when I need it. If I had a larger place, it would probably be on its own mounting table that I could, pull out and use. And that'll probably happen once I get my new place. But this is what I use for cutting metal, because these are basically a giant pair of scissors that are capable of cutting up to 14 gauge steel, as if it were butter. So here you can see I've got it mounted. I just used a clamp to clamp it to the table so that I can then easily put it away because I don't have enough room to keep this up all the time. But this is a piece of 16 gauge steel. This is what I make armor out of. It is fairly solid. It is cold rolled. Not, super tempered, but mild steel is what it's called. But it is very thick, very solid. It is good for armor. We use heavier stuff for the helmets, but other than that, it's good for everything else. And this thing is capable of cutting it like it were paper. Makes a smooth, clean cut. It will do a fairly straight cut, but it's also quite capable of doing a fairly sharp cut, or fairly sharp turn, which is impressive once you know what you're doing. You can actually do a curved cut, which is great when you're doing armor, because then, there are very few things on the human body that are a straight line. We tend to be more curves, and so the ability to cut curves into your metal is pretty cool. Again, not something you're likely to need very often, but I do occasionally make parts for Nerf out of metal, and this makes it much easier to cut things into strips, or, plates to cover things, or brackets, or stuff like that. So, if you're going to be doing stuff with metal, you're definitely going to want shears. Now, you can also cut metal. With either the hacksaw, the scroll saw, or the bandsaw if you have a metal cutting blade for it. So, those are other options. This is nice because it doesn't remove any material. It is just a cut, just like you were cutting paper, which makes it much easier. You don't have metal filings flying around. It's really very, very nice once you learn how to use them. So, there you have it. Alright, now I know a lot of this was actually covered in the tool videos that I did previously, but I wanted to go into cutting implements specifically, and show how all the varieties and what you can use things for and which ones are good for which kinds of cuts. And to reiterate that it is something that you need to take your time with. Good Nerf modding is time-consuming, especially complex integrations. That's why commissions for integrations are so expensive, because they take a lot of time, and time is valuable. It also requires a lot of tools, and tools are valuable, and maintaining them is expensive, and learning how to use them can be expensive, and so that is why a lot of expertise is used in that sort of thing. But you can get away with an awful lot with just simple tools. With the first couple of manual tools that I mentioned will actually allow you to do just about anything. There's a couple of modders that I know who have done some absolutely amazing builds with almost no tools, and it absolutely baffles me how they do it. They had no files, they had no power tools of any kind, they were doing it with a screwdriver, a Dremel, and epoxy, and that really is all you really need. It's just a lot easier, and you can do some things a lot cleaner if you have the right tools for it. So, there's my thought on cutting. The next video, next week, I'm going to actually show some practical techniques, as I'm going to be working on minimizing a stampede. So there are going to be cuts off the front, cut off the top, cut off an awful lot of the battery tray, and that is going to use quite a number of different tools. So certain cuts I'm going to do with the bandsaw, certain cuts I'm going to do with a handsaw, certain cuts I'm going to do with a Dremel. I'm going to be cleaning it with files, and I will show all of those different techniques in the next Monday Mod Tip. So stay tuned for that. I hope this was helpful. Thank you guys for watching.